Do you want to win your week 2 fantasy matchup? Well, to do so, you need to start the right players. These are the top 24 wide receivers you need to know to win week 2. Starting with Cooper Kupp, who continued his big slot plus role for the Rams week 1. He saw an NFL high 13 receptions on Thursday Night Football, and now he has an elite matchup versus Atlanta in D. Alfred. In week 1, Alfred allowed a 100% catch rate. 100% of the balls thrown his way, he allowed to be caught. Yeah, that's really good for Cooper Kupp. And then there's my wide receiver 2 on the week, Davante Adams. And Adams saw an elite 50% target share, meaning 50% of Derek Carr's pass attempts went to Davante, which led to a whopping 17 targets. And oh yeah, Davante's week 2 matchup is elite. He gets a matchup against the Cardinals secondary that was torched by Kansas City and ranks dead last according to Pro Football Focus. These are their 3 starting cornerbacks, and Davante will see them all because he moves into the slot role. He'll see Murphy, he'll see Marco Wilson, and Mullen. They were all outside the top 70 cornerbacks last year, including Marco Wilson, who week 1 was graded in coverage and overall as a bottom 10 cornerback by PFF. So expect another monster week from Davante. And speaking of monsters, my wide receiver 3 is Justin Jefferson, who broke my model week 1 literally. Because I've never seen a wide receiver see 75% of his team's air yards, meaning when it left Kirk Cousins' hand to where the ball landed, 75% of those yards went to Jefferson. Again, this is the highest share I've ever seen, which led to 11 targets and an unreal 39.5 fantasy points week 1. Now my wide receiver 4 is going to be Jamar Chase, who is second on the week with 16 targets. And he also saw 64 yards after the catch. Every time this guy catches a 2-yard screen, it seems like that's all he should get, and he ends up getting 9 to 11 yards. This was 3rd in the NFL behind only A.J. Brown and Justin Jefferson. But that's not all, because Chase played nearly 20% of his snaps from the slot, which is double about what he saw in 2021. And when you're in the slot, you'll face a worse cornerback more of the time and have more of the field to work with. Advantage Jamar Chase. Now, it's also worth noting that T. Higgins is in the concussion protocol, but as James Rapien says here, he's making good progress according to head coach Zach Taylor, so that's good to track. But if he was to miss, better for Jamar Chase's usage. Finishing out my top 5 is going to be Stefon Diggs, who has a matchup versus Tennessee and a good one versus cornerback Fulton. You see, in week 1, Christian Fulton was one of the worst cornerbacks in the NFL. He allowed a 100% catch rate, 84 yards, and a touchdown on his 4 targets his way. Stefon Diggs is going to be a lot better than the Giants receivers he faced week 1. And now for my wide receiver 6. It's going to be Tyreek Hill, who had a fantastic debut in Miami. He earned a 41% target share, the 3rd highest in the league. And now check this out. Tyreek also still saw deep targets, so a lot of these things were like manufactured screens, but he saw 3 deep targets, 20 plus yards, which led the NFL. And believe it or not, his week 1 yards per reception were higher than his 2021 average with Patrick Mahomes, and in 2021 he finished as the wide receiver 6. This is good news for Tyreek. So much so that I'm taking him over 70.5 receiving yards this week. I have him projected out in the 80 receiving yard department, and if you want to take this, you can click the link in the description to get it. You'll get a 100% deposit match and my weekly rankings and projections for the entire season, which includes a $20 Amazon gift card. All those beautiful perks for you. If you want to know more, it's linked in the description. And that takes us into my wide receiver 7, Mike Evans, who week 1, he led the Bucs with a 73% snap share, and this should have been higher. They pulled their starters after a blowout later in the game. He ran 23 routes, which also led the team, and then he saw a nice 7 targets. And now Chris Godwin is expected to miss some time. And it was good to see Evans also be efficient, not just see the targets, but he was top 15 in yards per route run, which was 92% better than his average last year when he was not efficient. This is great news early on. Now, this next man honestly might start cracking the top 5 soon, and that's A.J. Brown, who saw 11 targets in his Eagles debut. And he ranks 2nd only behind Justin Jefferson in yards after the catch. He was dynamic. But here's the big thing. Brown played 38% of his snaps from the slot, which is 17% more than his career average, and this led to a lot better matchups for him week 1. And speaking of good matchups, he's going to have that against the Vikings week 2. None of their cornerbacks weigh over 203 pounds, and yeah, he weighs 230 pounds. Massive weight and size advantage, which is big, especially in the red zone, and they all allowed at least 67% of their passes their way to be caught last week. Big week in store for A.J. Brown. Now we get to my wide receiver 9, and it's Mike Williams. And I know what you're saying. What do you mean Mike Williams? He stinks. Calm down. It was just 1 week. And in that 1 week, he led the team with 62 snaps, pretty damn elite, and 31 routes. Very solid. Now, of course, the bad news is he only had 2 catches on 4 targets, and he let a lot of you down who took him in like the 4th round of your fantasy drafts. But the usage was still elite, and that's not all. Keenan Allen has already been ruled out for Thursday Night Football, so that's good for Williams. And keep in mind, he was paid to a top 12 wide receiver contract at the time of signing, 3 years, $60 million this offseason. They have big plans for Williams this year. Now, to round out the top 10, we get Michael Pittman. And Pittman saw 13 targets week 1, his first game with Matt Ryan, the 2nd most of his career, and 7 more than any other Colts receiver. This means Pittman has a real shot to see 150 targets this year. And wide receivers who see this much volume, 84% of the time finish as a top 10 fantasy receiver. So Pittman is in my top 10, and my number 11 receiver is Brandon Cooks, who very quietly saw 12 targets week 1. And now in his career, that's now 13 games last year and week 1 of this year with Davis Mills, he averages right here 9.9 targets per game. And that 9.9 targets per game is actually 24% more than he saw with Deshaun Watson. Consider him a consistent top 20 wide receiver this season. And I love his over 60.5 receiving yard prop on prizepicks.com. I have him for 77 yards this week. You can take that link down below and you'll get those extra perks, the Amazon gift card, and also the weekly rankings and projections. And now this next guy might surprise you. He's my wide receiver 12, and that's Deebo Samuel, who, believe it or not, was graded outside the top 120 receivers in PFF. He didn't play well week 1. Now, despite playing that poorly, and it was a bad weather game with Trey Lance, who's still inexperienced, he still put up 12.6 fantasy points. And now Elijah Mitchell, according to Adam Schefter, is going to be sidelined for about 2 months, which means Deebo's probably going to see 5+ rushing attempts a game. But here's the big concern. Trey Lance has to get better, because only 62% of Deebo's targets were catchable, meaning 38% of them were not even catchable. They were pointless to even have the target. Now, of course, the weather was bad here, and we can blame it on that, and let's hope that's all it was. Now to my wide receiver 13, another Bills receiver here versus the Titans, and Gabriel Davis. And now Gabe Davis is also going to have that solid matchup like Stephon Diggs versus Titans secondary. And let's see how Davis played week 1. Davis was targeted on 15% of his routes, which was outside the top 60 wide receivers in the NFL. Honestly, this isn't great, but when you play in the #1 offense in the NFL, it makes up for it because of the explosive plays and the touchdown upside from 20+ yards out like we saw last week. Because similar to Deebo Samuel, even though Davis didn't play all that well or efficient last week, he still finished as a top 15 fantasy receiver. What happens when he actually starts playing well and efficient? Translation, this speaks volumes for his upside. And now we get to a man who plays on Thursday night, and whether you're watching this before or after the game, Juju Smith-Schuster, he was just fine week 1. He saw a solid 8 targets, but it was on just a 20% target rate. For the most part, the ball got spread around in this offense. But here's the thing. Juju was on the field for only 82% of Patrick Mahomes' dropbacks. They actually rotated through 5 wide receivers in this game, so Juju was coming off the field a decent amount, and he didn't see a red zone target in this game. So these are some concerns, but thanks to the offense he's in, he's still a top 20 receiver this week. But if he has a big Thursday night, be ready to sell high on him heading into week 3. Now my wide receiver 15 is T. Higgins, who's in the concussion protocol. He's trending in the right direction. If he was to miss, Tyler Boyd becomes a top 30 receiver, but here's what Higgins did week 1. He only ran 14 routes and saw just 2 targets, which isn't great, but this is a really small sample size to draw any conclusions from, including Joe Burrow throwing a lot of picks in that game early on. But we know Higgins is a unique talent, and he has a fantastic matchup this week. He will face the Dallas Cowboys secondary and primarily Anthony Brown. He allowed 6 receptions for over 100 yards, and 75% of the ball is his way to be caught. Yeah, this is a good matchup for T. Higgins. And Higgins will also see some Trevion Diggs, maybe about a third of his snaps, and Diggs week 1 wasn't great. 76th out of 95 graded cornerbacks according to PFF. Again, a good matchup. Now we get to my wide receiver 16, DJ Moore. Now DJ Moore this week has a favorable matchup against the Giants secondary that ranked in coverage week 1 30th out of 32 teams. And DJ Moore saw a respectable 24% target share week 1, but it only translated to 6 targets because they didn't run a lot of plays at all in Carolina. In fact, they ran the second fewest plays in the league with just 50 offensive plays ran. If this number ends up increasing to league average around 60 or 65, Moore is going to start to see 8 to 10 target games as soon as this week. And that takes us to my wide receiver 17, Amon-Ra St. Brown. And St. Brown had 12 targets week 1. He led the Lions. Now, if you take that 12 targets and you look back at last year, he had 10, 11, 11, 12, 12, 12 to close the season. That's 7 straight games of 10+ targets. And he finishes a top 20 wide receiver each time. He's as consistent as they come. And my wide receiver 18 is CeeDee Lamb, who lost Dak Prescott, and this is terrible news. Lamb was actually targeted 11 times week 1, but only 45% of his targets were catchable, meaning that 50+% of his targets were not catchable. They were pointless to even have. This is bad news. But check this out. In 2 career starts with Cooper Rush, CeeDee Lamb averages 10 targets per game, which is not that bad. And now Amari Cooper is gone. There's no Michael Gallup, which there were in these other 2 games. So Lamb is going to be force-fed the ball. Let's just hope they're more accurate passes this week. And I'm actually taking Lamb over 60.5 receiving yards. He averages over 70 with Cooper Rush in his career. I have him projected for over 70 this week. You can take it down below this prop and the other ones that we've talked about. You get that 100% deposit match and my weekly rankings projections and the $20 Amazon gift card. Now let's start to round out this top 20 with the number 19 wide receiver in Christian Kirk, who saw elite usage week 1. Kirk led all wide receivers with 10 slot targets and 6 slot receptions. Having this type of slot usage is very good. This is where he thrived when he had his best games with the Cardinals. And he also very quietly saw the second highest target share of his career at 32%. This is an elite number. And he was surprisingly a top 20 efficiency receiver. So we have the efficiency, the volume, and the slot usage. This is what the makings of a breakout wide receiver look like. And my number 20 wide receiver closing out the top 20, Mike Michael Thomas. Saw a very respectable 25% target share in his first game since 2020. He scored 2 touchdowns and was a top 10 wide receiver. And oh yeah, by the way, this is very good news. He was a top 10 targeted receiver when it was man coverage. Meaning when Jameis snapped the ball and saw man, he threw it Michael Thomas's way and Michael Thomas won. Now my number 21 wide receiver, another guy like Mike Williams who let a lot of people down week 1, Allen Robinson. And like his teammate Cooper Kupp, he's going to see about 40 to 50%, if not more, of his snaps against D. Alfred and this secondary in Atlanta, which is a good matchup. Now here's what you need to know. Robinson actually ran a route on 96% of Stafford's dropbacks, and he saw 96% of the snaps, top 10 of any receiver last week. Translation, his usage was elite, and the volume will come. And not to mention, the Rams are 10.5-point favorites with a 29-point team total. They're going to score points this week. Don't be shocked if he finds the end zone. And my number 22 wide receiver this week, Marquise Hollywood Brown, who saw just 6 targets last week, but the good news is these were high upside targets. 2 of them were in the red zone, and 2 of them were deep targets of 20+ yards. And he should draw a favorable matchup week 2. You see, the Raiders rookie Nate Hobbs, a 5th round cornerback, was actually really good week 1. He was the number 5 graded cornerback by Pro Football Focus. But the good news for Hollywood Brown is Hobbs was in the slot for 33 snaps last week. And Brown only played 8 slot snaps, so he's actually going to get to dodge Hobbs in week 2. And instead, he'll face Rocky Sin, who gave up 4 catches and 60 yards in coverage. Not great week 1. Now to my number 23 wide receiver, Jerry Jeudy, who operated as the primary slot wide receiver week 1 for Russell Wilson. And we know Russell Wilson, as you can see in my tweet right here, loves his slot receivers. Remember Tyler Lockett and Doug Baldwin? Yeah, Jeudy saw 4 slot targets week 1, including a 67-yard touchdown. He's a top 24 option this week, and so is Julio Jones. That's right, Julio Jones is the wide receiver 2 now for Tom Brady with Chris Godwin out. And he earned a respectable 19% target share week 1. Keep in mind, this includes when Chris Godwin was in the game. But more importantly, he was still wildly efficient. A top 15 efficiency receiver week 1, he still has the juice. Plus, he was getting open often downfield. On these deep crosses, that's kind of why they got him. He was 2nd in the NFL with an average target distance of 22 yards. These are your top 24 receivers to get you going for week 2. If you want to see more, my entire rankings, the link is in the description. And if you want to see the top 24 running backs you need to know about, well then check out this beautiful video right here. And be sure to smack around your competition in week 2 with this information.